Calvin isn't some amazing person who simply created himself. He's not some sort of self-made person. Calvin is not dominant. He sees himself as a part of a wider web of theologians. Calvin will be dead in 9 years. This period of his supporters being in power is at the end of his life, most of which is an extremely ill man. It's simply historically not. He was dominant in many ways, but he did not ever rule the city.
The following is a segment from my interview with Yale University's Titus Street Professor of Ecclesiastical History and author of a biography of John Calvin named simply Calvin, Dr. Bruce Gordon. In this segment, Dr. Gordon seeks to demonstrate the erroneous nature of the myth that John Calvin was in some way the ruler of Geneva. The full interview is full of insight regarding Calvin and the Reformation, and I plan to release it soon. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy the following teaser. With these things being said, Dr. Gordon, would you be able to provide us, hopefully you haven't had to do this too much, I know that you're a professor, but if you would be willing to provide us with a basic historical context of Calvin and his era, speaking of making sure that we are trying to tune into a proper historical understanding, would you be able to paint us a basic picture of Calvin and his historical context?
Well, I can try. I think probably the most misleading thing, which is found amongst both those who are enthusiastic supporters of Calvin and those who are detractors, and I saw some of the comments you shared with me. But what those people have in common, I would say, is that they vastly overestimate Calvin's authority in the 16th century. We have a tendency to take individuals out of periods and make them responsible for just about everything that happened. And Calvin is often referred to as the ruler of Geneva, or the great theologian of the Reformed faith, or often this is called Calvinism. Uh, these things, these ideas simply can't be sustained historically. Um, he was, as I say, born in northern France to a reasonably well-off family. He had a wonderful education in Paris. He was clearly a prodigious student, very talented. He studied law. He got a very good legal education. He became involved with a circle of those who were called evangelicals in the sense that they held to Luther's idea of the centrality of the Word of God. They were uh, persecuted, and after a series of events, he fled France and went to Basel in Switzerland, a city where the great humanist Erasmus was. At that point, Calvin had had some sort of conversion experience that he writes about. It's not entirely clear what he converted to, but to some sort of evangelical faith that placed the Bible at the center. It was enough of a conversion that he felt he could not stay in Catholic France. So he has this life that moves from place to place. But to know his story is to know that this isn't some man who automatically dominated everything he did. For much of his life, he was dependent on the patronage of other people, of mentors, of various teachers. He was in exile. He did not have money. He was not a wealthy person. He didn't hold any particular position. So the Calvin who is taking shape during the 1530s is a relatively obscure figure. He's not well known. He's certainly a, around important people, but he himself is not a major figure. He goes to Geneva under the influence of a friend. He turns out to have completely mishandled the situation when he's in Geneva, and they several years later, a couple of years later, they throw him out. He's tossed out of Geneva, and when he goes out of Geneva, he's still a kind of nobody. No one's that much interested in him until one major figure, Martin Bucer, brings him to Strasbourg, and he sees in Calvin a very talented person, but a person who's still very unformed. And so he puts Calvin to work as a pastor in the French-speaking church in Strasbourg. And essentially, Martin Bucer teaches Calvin how to be a pastor and how to be a preacher. Because at that point, Calvin had no particular, he was a trained lawyer, but he had no particular qualifications for anything. So one thing I would want to emphasize is that Calvin isn't some amazing person who simply created himself. He's not some sort of self-made person. His life was shaped strongly by various others who whose impact on him was essential to how the story played out. I don't want to go on at great length about this, but I want to make a couple of other points. Calvin is invited back to Geneva in 1541. He doesn't particularly want to go, but then he thinks it's perhaps God's calling. He returns to Geneva on the grounds that they will accept a a certain type of reformed worship and church government. The arrangement is made. But for the next 15 years, Calvin is in Geneva as one of the leading preachers and certainly an influential figure. But the governing magistrates in the city, for the most part, dislike him intensely. They are native Genevans, and he is this outsider, a Frenchman. He is obviously has a combative nature. He's in other ways extremely talented. But for 15 years, there's a very tense relationship within Geneva. In no way at all did Calvin dominate the city politically. He was, at many times, he believed he would be thrown out of the city again. So on the one hand, he is this person who's becoming a successful author through the writing of his major work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, which are going through various editions. His influence is significant, but he's not dominating the city. And on the wider theological world of, he is very closely connected to other people, many of whom he sees as his superiors. The reformer Heinrich Bullinger in Zurich, the reformer Philip Melanchthon in Wittenberg, very close to Luther. Calvin is not dominant. He sees himself as a part of a wider web of theologians. And people in his day did not see Calvin as this superstar figure that to whom everybody else should be paying their respects. So the story is more complex. Calvin is in a city where his relationships with the rulers are very difficult, very sensitive, lots of conflict. And then in 1555, finally, the supporters of Calvin win the civic elections, and for the first time, the politicians who are more favorable to Calvin are running the city. But this is in 1555. Calvin will be dead in 9 years. This period of his supporters being in power is at the end of his life, most of which he's an extremely ill man, confined to his bed. So this idea that he is the ruler of Geneva, greatly flatters what he was. It's how people think about him. It's simply historically not. He was dominant in many ways, but he did not ever rule the city. And if you're going to understand Calvin's situation, we need to know that the whole relationship between politics and religion in this 16th century Reformation was constantly contested. The role of where was the religious authority, where was political authority. And that story that we see in Calvin's Geneva it's playing out in England, it's playing out in Germany, it's playing out in France, it's playing out in Switzerland. This whole question about whether religious reform should be controlled by the political authorities or whether preachers should have the right to preach the pure word of God, even if that meant criticizing political rulers. This whole period is an incredibly fraught period of the Reformation where they're trying to work out this relationship, and no religious figure anywhere, even Luther in Wittenberg, was able to control the political circumstances in anything like we often imagine they did. They simply didn't have that kind of authority. So to talk about the life of Calvin is to talk about a person who had considerable influence, but nothing like the way he's often described as. And we need to understand him within that context to realize why his successes and failures happened the way they did. So this basically what I'm saying, this myth of Calvin as the dictator of Geneva is just simply not true.
Gotcha.
And that has
Uh,
nothing to do with whether you like Calvin or not.